The Mafia Boss's triplets were fading away, until the Black Maid made an unthinkable choice. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Victor Callahan stood at the threshold of the nursery he had ordered built to the highest standard money could buy. Yet nothing in the room answered the fear tightening his chest as three small monitors pulsed unevenly, their soft tones drifting in and out like tired breaths after a long climb. The triplets lay side by side in identical cribs, blankets tucked with care, tiny fingers curled, as if holding on to something only they could feel. And for the first time in his life, Victor Callahan felt powerless in a way no rival or setback had ever managed to achieve. He had negotiated deals in rooms thicker with tension than this, had faced men who spoke in whispers and consequences, but none of that prepared him for watching three lives slow in front of his eyes while the best doctors in the city spoke in careful phrases and avoided meeting his gaze. The mansion beyond the nursery doors continued its quiet routines, polished floors reflecting warm light, clocks ticking with perfect precision, yet time itself seemed to hesitate here, stretching seconds into long, unbearable moments. Nurses adjusted equipment with gentle hands, their expressions calm by training, while Victor listened for meaning in every sound, searching for hope in the smallest change of rhythm. He thought of the night the triplets were born, the suddenness of their arrival, the way he had stood frozen as three cries filled the room at once, a chaos that had felt like promise then, and he wondered how something that began so loudly could fade so quietly. Somewhere behind him, unnoticed by most, Eliza Moore paused her work, a cleaning cloth resting still in her hands as she watched the scene from the corner she was expected to occupy, the place reserved for those meant to remain unseen. She had learned the mansion's rules quickly, learned how to move without drawing attention, how to keep her eyes lowered and her presence small, yet her gaze lingered on the cribs longer than was proper, drawn by a familiarity she could not ignore. Victor did not see her at first. His focus remained fixed on the monitors, on the subtle rise and fall of three chests that seemed lighter with every passing minute, and he wondered how a man who controlled entire blocks of the city could not command a single breath to stay. The room held its silence like a held note, and in that silence something fragile waited, unnoticed, gathering the courage to step forward. Eliza Moore had learned early that survival depended on being quiet, and the Callahan mansion rewarded silence more than skill, so she moved through its halls like a shadow, measured steps, soft hands, never lingering where she did not belong. She was 28 years old, though the lines of careful restraint around her eyes made her seem older, and she had worked here just long enough to understand that power did not need to announce itself to be felt. It lived in the pauses between words, in the way doors closed without explanation, and how people like her were addressed by job title rather than name. She cleaned the nursery floors each morning before the doctors arrived, polished surfaces no one would notice unless they were dirty, and listened to conversations meant to pass over her head, learning when to step back and when to disappear entirely. The staff spoke in hushed tones about the triplets, about how the house had changed since their condition worsened, about how even Victor Callahan no longer filled rooms the way he used to, but no one asked Eliza what she saw when she looked at the children, because no one imagined she saw anything beyond work. Yet standing there now, cloth forgotten in her hands, she felt a familiar tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with memory. She remembered a smaller room in another part of the city, remembered counting breaths in the dark, remembered how helplessness could settle into the bones when hope slipped away inch by inch. Eliza did not speak of that time, not to co-workers who came and went, not to supervisors who valued efficiency over understanding, and certainly not to the man whose name commanded respect wherever it was whispered. She had learned that grief, like strength, was something best carried alone. A nurse brushed past her without acknowledgement, adjusting equipment with a practiced calm, and Eliza stepped farther back, instinctively shrinking into the role expected of her, the role of background, of function, of someone whose presence was useful but whose thoughts were irrelevant. Victor paced once, stopped, then stood motionless again, his focus fixed on the monitors as if willpower alone might change what they displayed, and the doctor spoke softly about observation and waiting, words that sounded careful but empty. Eliza watched the smallest of the three boys stir, his fingers twitching against the blanket, and her breath caught before she could stop it. She turned away quickly, schooling her expression, reminding herself that noticing was a risk, that caring too visibly could be mistaken for overstepping, and overstepping had consequences in a house like this. When Margaret Huxley, the head of household operations, entered the room, her gaze flicked to Eliza immediately, sharp and assessing, and Eliza understood without words what was being asked of her. This was not her place, not now, not ever. She nodded once, the movement small and obedient, and began to retreat toward the door, but as she did, she glanced back one last time at the cribs lined up so carefully, 3 lives balanced on numbers and waiting. Something inside her shifted then, subtle but undeniable, as if a decision had been quietly set in motion long before this moment, waiting only for recognition. Eliza stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her, and leaned against the cool wall, steadying herself as the sounds of the nursery faded. She told herself to breathe, to remember her role, to stay invisible, but beneath that familiar discipline, another truth pressed forward, one she could not yet name, but could no longer ignore. The hallway felt longer than it ever had, its polished floors reflecting Eliza more back at herself as she walked with measured steps, her posture composed even as her thoughts raced beneath the calm she had perfected over years of staying unnoticed. Inside the nursery, the doors closed gently, but the quiet that followed was heavier than sound, filled with decisions being made without her, about lives she could not stop thinking about. Margaret Huxley's voice carried faintly through the wood, controlled and efficient, instructing staff schedules, adjusting access, tightening the circle around the children as if exclusion itself could serve as protection. Eliza understood the message clearly enough. The situation had grown serious, and seriousness in a house like this meant fewer witnesses, fewer risks, fewer people who did not need to know. She returned to her duties with practiced focus, wiping counters, folding linens, aligning objects until they were perfectly square, yet her attention drifted back to the nursery again and again, pulled by something deeper than curiosity. Victor Callahan passed through the corridor once, his steps purposeful, his expression closed, and he did not look at her as he went by, not out of cruelty, but because men like him rarely noticed those who existed to serve quietly. Eliza lowered her eyes instinctively, aware of the invisible line that separated their worlds, and felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a function rather than a person. The staff kitchen buzzed softly with whispered updates, cautious speculation traded between sips of coffee, but when Eliza entered, the conversation thinned, glances sliding away from her, as if her presence disrupted something private. No one asked her opinion, no one expected insight, and she took her place at the far end of the room, eating quickly, listening without reacting. A nurse mentioned that the doctors were running out of options, that observation had replaced intervention, and Eliza's fingers tightened around her cup before she forced them to relax. She excused herself early, citing work, and returned to the upper floors, where the air felt cooler and the silence more pronounced. At the nursery doors, she paused, not crossing the threshold, just standing close enough to hear the steady hum of machines and the faint movement within. A security staff member glanced at her, his expression neutral but firm, and she understood that even standing here was a privilege that could be revoked. She stepped back immediately, offering a polite nod, retreating without protest, because compliance had always kept her safe. Yet as she moved away, a sense of quiet indignation settled over her, not loud enough to draw attention, but steady, persistent, and growing. She had been excluded before, dismissed gently, efficiently, without raised voices or overt cruelty, and she knew that kind of dismissal could cut deeper than open anger. In the hours that followed, Eliza worked without pause, keeping her hands busy, her face unreadable, while her mind returned to images she could not shake, 3 small faces pale against white blankets, 3 lives waiting for an answer no one seemed able to give. When night fell and the mansion dimmed, She found herself alone in the laundry room, the rhythmic sound of machines filling the space. And for the first time that day, she let her composure slip just enough to acknowledge what she felt. This was not her place. They had made that clear, but distance did not dull responsibility, and being told to step aside did not erase what she knew in her bones. Eliza straightened, inhaled slowly, and resumed her work, but something had changed, subtle and irreversible, as if being pushed away had only sharpened her resolve. She had been excluded from the room where decisions were made, but she had not been excluded from the truth unfolding there, and she understood now that staying invisible would not be enough. The laundry room was warm with steam, the air carrying the faint scent of detergent and cotton as Eliza Moore stood alone, hands resting against the edge of a stainless steel table while the machines turned steadily behind her, their rhythm slow and relentless. This was where she allowed herself to think, because no one ever came looking for answers in a place meant for cleaning up after others. She stared at her reflection in the polished metal, seeing not the uniform she wore but the woman beneath it, the parts of herself she kept carefully hidden. Memory rose without permission, not as a rush but as a quiet return, carrying with it the weight of a small room years ago, a crib placed too close to a window that let in more cold than light, and the sound of counting breaths through the night, because sleep felt like a risk she could not afford. Eliza closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself as that familiar ache spread through her chest, the kind that never fully disappeared, only learned how to wait. She had not spoken of her loss when she came to work at the Callahan mansion, had not written it on any form or shared it during interviews, because grief was not something employers valued, and she had learned to present herself as uncomplicated, capable, and quiet. Yet her body remembered things her voice never said, remembered rhythms and instincts shaped by love and responsibility, remembered what it meant to give without expectation of return. She pressed a hand lightly against herself, breathing slowly, grounding herself in the present as the reality of the day settled around her. Upstairs, 3 children she was not allowed to touch were slipping further away, and downstairs, she was expected to fold sheets and pretend that nothing beyond her job description mattered. The injustice of that contrast tightened her resolve rather than breaking it. Eliza had lived long enough knowing that systems often protected themselves first, that rules were written to maintain order rather than save lives, and that waiting politely rarely changed outcomes when time itself was the enemy. She thought of Victor Callahan, a man surrounded by power and resources, standing helpless before something money could not fix, and she wondered if he understood, yet that solutions did not always come from places of authority. The machines behind her clicked and slowed, signaling the end of a cycle, and she moved automatically, unloading warm linens, folding them with practiced precision, her movements calm even as her thoughts sharpened. This was not impulse or desperation. It was recognition, the kind that settled slowly, connecting past and present with an uncomfortable clarity. Eliza knew the cost of stepping forward in a house like this, knew how quickly someone in her position could be dismissed, silenced, or replaced, but she also knew what it felt like to regret hesitation, to replay moments when fear outweighed action. She finished her work, aligning the last folded towel perfectly, and stood there for a moment longer, listening to the distant hum of the mansion settling into night. Somewhere above her, machines continued to mark time for 3 fragile lives, and the knowledge pressed against her like a question that would not wait. Eliza straightened, her expression composed, her posture steady, and made a decision that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. She would not announce herself or demand attention. That was not her way. But she would not remain silent either, not when silence had already taken so much from her. With one last breath, she turned off the lights, left the laundry room behind, and walked back toward the stairs, carrying with her the understanding that whatever came next would change everything, whether anyone was ready for it or not. Eliza Moore stopped outside the nursery doors, her hand hovering inches from the polished wood as if the barrier itself could feel the weight of her decision. And for a brief moment, she considered turning back, not because she doubted what she knew, but because she understood exactly what crossing this line meant. Inside, voices moved in low, controlled tones, the language of professionals discussing limits and probabilities, and beneath it all the steady, uneven cadence of machines that had begun to sound less like reassurance and more like a countdown. Eliza straightened her shoulders, smoothed the front of her uniform, and knocked once, the sound quiet but deliberate, a disruption that did not ask permission. The room shifted instantly as eyes turned, surprise flickering across faces and used to being interrupted by someone like her, and Margaret Huxley's expression hardened in reflex before she could stop it. Victor Callahan looked up last, his gaze sharp and tired, carrying the kind of authority that had ended conversations far more significant than this without a single raised word. Eliza stepped inside only far enough to be seen, careful not to approach the cribs, careful not to assume a place she had not been given, yet she did not lower her eyes. The silence stretched, heavy and questioning, until Victor spoke, his voice controlled but edged with strain, asking why she was there when she had been instructed to leave this floor. Eliza felt the attention settle on her like a physical weight, every instinct urging retreat, urging compliance, but she held her ground, her voice steady when she answered that she understood the instruction and that she would leave as soon as she said what she needed to say. Margaret moved first, stepping forward with a warning in her tone, reminding Eliza of protocol, of boundaries, of her role, but Eliza did not look at her, did not argue or apologize. She addressed Victor directly, because this was not a request for permission but an acknowledgement of reality. She told him that the doctors were right about one thing, that time was no longer on their side, and the subtle shift in the room told her she had struck something raw. Victor's jaw tightened, his patience thinning, and he asked her again, more firmly, what she thought she could possibly add that had not already been considered by specialists with decades of experience. Eliza inhaled slowly, grounding herself, and said that experience did not always come with credentials, that sometimes it came from living through what others only studied, and that she knew something about the condition affecting his sons that had not been discussed openly. A murmur rippled through the room, disbelief mixing with irritation, and Victor took a step closer, his presence imposing, a silent reminder of the imbalance between them. Yet Eliza did not step back. She told him that what she was about to say would sound impossible, that it would challenge rules and comfort alike, and that she would accept whatever consequence followed, but that she would not forgive herself if she stayed silent and watched 3 children slip away knowing she had not spoken. The room seemed to contract around them, every breath audible now, and Victor studied her with new intensity, not anger, but something closer to reluctant attention. He asked her what she was proposing, his voice low, controlled, and Eliza met his gaze without flinching as she answered that she could help them, not without cost and not without risk, but in a way that no one else in the room could. The words hung between them, fragile and dangerous, and for the first time since the crisis began, the steady certainty of authority gave way to something unfamiliar, a hesitation born not of weakness, but of the realization that solutions sometimes came from places power was conditioned to ignore. Victor Callahan did not respond immediately, and the pause that followed Eliza Moore's words felt heavier than any raised voice, as if the room itself were waiting to see which of them would move first. He studied her with a gaze that had once decided fates without hesitation, yet now carried something unfamiliar, a careful weighing that had nothing to do with threats or leverage. Eliza remained still, hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing even, because she knew that explaining too quickly would sound like desperation, and desperation was easy to dismiss. One of the doctors cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim authority by listing risks and protocols, reminding everyone present that unconventional ideas often came from misunderstanding rather than insight. But Victor lifted a hand slightly, silencing him without looking away from Eliza. He asked her to explain, slowly, exactly what she believed she could do, and the room leaned in, skepticism sharp but curiosity sharper. Eliza chose her words with care, not embellishing, not dramatizing, because this was not about convincing them with emotion but about stating a truth that existed whether they accepted it or not. She explained that her understanding came from lived experience, from a time when medical options were limited and survival depended on something deeply human rather than technological, and that the condition affecting the triplets had reached a point where waiting was no longer neutral. It was a decision with consequences. She acknowledged openly that what she was suggesting would violate expectations, that it would place strain on her own body and carry uncertainty no one could fully quantify, and that she would not pretend otherwise. The doctors exchanged looks, discomfort spreading through their professional calm as they began to understand the direction of her words, and Margaret Huxley's lips pressed into a thin line, her instincts warning her that this conversation was veering into territory the household was not prepared to navigate. Victor listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, absorbing not just the content of Eliza's proposal, but the steadiness with which she delivered it, the absence of self-interest, the quiet acceptance of personal cost. When she finished, the room fell silent again, the machines marking time with relentless impartiality. Victor asked her what she would expect in return, his tone testing for motive, and Eliza answered honestly that she expected nothing, not protection, not compensation, not a change in status, only the chance to try before it was too late. That answer unsettled him more than any demand could have. He paced once, the movement restrained, and stopped beside the cribs, looking down at his sons as if seeing them anew, not as heirs or symbols, but as fragile lives that did not care about rules or reputation. The doctor spoke again, outlining consent requirements, ethical considerations, legal exposure, their voices layering complexity over urgency. But Victor heard something else beneath it all, the simple reality that every option now carried risk, and that refusing to act was itself a choice. He turned back to Eliza, his voice lower, stripped of command, and asked her if she understood what she was offering, not in theory but in consequence, the strain, the scrutiny, the possibility that it might not be enough. Eliza met his gaze steadily and said that she understood completely, that she had lived with loss before, and that what haunted her was not pain but regret, the knowledge of having stood aside when action was possible. The room held its breath as Victor considered the unthinkable, the idea that salvation might come from someone he had been conditioned to overlook. And in that suspended moment, power and humility collided, leaving only the weight of responsibility and the quiet understanding that whatever decision he made would define him far beyond this room. The decision, once made, did not announce itself with ceremony. It settled quietly over the room as Victor Callahan gave a single nod that carried more weight than any signature, and the doctors moved with renewed urgency, their professionalism tightening around a plan they had never expected to consider. There was no celebration, no relief, only a shared understanding that this path was narrow and demanded absolute focus. Eliza Moore followed their instructions carefully, listening more than speaking, absorbing every detail, because this was not the moment for uncertainty. Victor stepped back, creating space where his presence had dominated moments before, and for the first time since his sons had been born, he turned his face away, not out of fear but out of respect for what was about to be asked of someone else. The room shifted into a different rhythm, quieter, more deliberate, as equipment was adjusted and unnecessary observers were dismissed, leaving only those whose roles were essential. Eliza felt the weight of their attention without meeting their eyes, centering herself with slow breaths, aware of the strain ahead, but grounded in the clarity of purpose that had carried her this far. She thought briefly of the laundry room, of the folded linens and the routine that had defined her days, and understood that there would be no returning to that simplicity after tonight, regardless of outcome. The doctor spoke to her plainly, outlining what would be required, the limits of what science could predict, and Eliza listened, acknowledging each point with calm acceptance. When asked one final time if she wished to proceed, she answered without hesitation, because hesitation had already taken enough from her life. Victor stood near the door, his hands clenched at his sides, listening to the steady hum of machines and the careful movements unfolding behind him. And he felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, a recognition that power did not grant immunity from debt. Time passed in measured increments, marked by quiet instructions and the disciplined focus of people committed to doing their part. And throughout it all, Eliza remained composed, her strength expressed not through force but through endurance. The room seemed to contract around the cribs, every sound amplified, every breath counted, and when the process began, it did so without drama, without spectacle, just the steady progression of one human being offering what she could so that others might have a chance. Victor closed his eyes briefly, The simple act of not watching feeling like the hardest decision he had made all night, because watching would have meant claiming ownership over a sacrifice that was not his to make. Outside the room, the mansion held its breath, the usual movements suspended as if the walls themselves understood the gravity of what was unfolding. Inside, Eliza focused on the present moment, on maintaining balance and calm, on trusting the instincts shaped by loss and love alike. The machines responded gradually, not with sudden change, but with subtle shifts that required careful observation, and the doctors leaned in, their expressions guarded but attentive. No one spoke of hope aloud, because hope felt too fragile to name, but it existed nonetheless, threading its way through the silence. As the final steps were completed, Eliza felt the tolls settle into her body, a deep weariness tempered by resolve, and she allowed herself to rest back, trusting the professionals to take over. Victor opened his eyes then, turning slowly to face the room again, and what he saw was not a miracle yet, but something just as powerful, the undeniable evidence of courage where he had least expected it, and the understanding that whatever followed, nothing in this house would ever be the same. Time did not rush back into the room when the process ended. It crept in cautiously, measured by the soft tones of monitors that began to settle into steadier patterns, subtle at first, almost imperceptible unless one was trained to notice change where none had existed before. A doctor leaned closer to the screens, his brow furrowing, then smoothing, as numbers adjusted in small but meaningful ways, and another nurse checked the triplets one by one, her movements careful, her voice kept low, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile balance that had formed. Eliza Moore lay resting nearby, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and controlled, the toll of the effort evident in the way her shoulders rose and fell with deliberate care, yet there was no sign of panic in her expression, only exhaustion tempered by resolve. Victor Callahan watched from a distance, unwilling to intrude, every instinct urging him forward while another, newer instinct held him back, reminding him that this moment did not belong to him. Minutes passed, then more, and with each passing interval the machines continued their quiet confirmation that something had shifted, not dramatically, not miraculously, but enough to change the conversation from endings to possibilities. One of the doctors spoke at last, his voice restrained but edged with disbelief as he noted stabilization across all three readings, something he had not expected to see so soon, and the room responded not with celebration, but with a collective release of tension, shoulders lowering, breaths deepening, as if everyone had been holding themselves rigid against disappointment. Victor felt his knees weaken slightly, the realization hitting him not as relief, but as a delayed wave of gratitude so profound it left him momentarily unsteady. He reached for the back of a chair, steadying himself, eyes never leaving the cribs where his sons now rested more peacefully than they had hours before. A nurse approached Eliza, checking her condition, murmuring reassurance, and Eliza opened her eyes briefly, orienting herself, her gaze moving instinctively toward the children before she allowed herself to rest again. The exchange did not go unnoticed by Victor, and something tightened in his chest as he understood that her concern had never been abstract or theoretical, it had been deeply personal from the beginning. The doctors continued their assessments, careful not to promise more than the moment warranted, emphasizing that monitoring would continue, that progress was not guaranteed, yet their tone had shifted, infused now with cautious respect for an outcome none of them had anticipated. Victor nodded at each update, absorbing the information with a focus sharpened by humility, aware that no amount of authority could compel gratitude where it was not freely given. When the room finally quieted, when the essential checks were complete and the immediate urgency eased, Victor approached Eliza slowly, stopping a few feet away as if unsure of his right to be closer. He looked at her then, really looked at her, not as staff or background or convenience, but as the person who had altered the course of his life with a choice that asked for nothing in return. He did not speak, because words felt insufficient, and Eliza did not open her eyes again, resting as her body demanded, trusting that what mattered most had been done. The mansion beyond the nursery resumed its subdued rhythm, unaware of the transformation that had taken place within its walls, but Victor remained still, standing witness to a truth he would carry forward, that dignity did not announce itself with power, It revealed itself quietly, in moments where sacrifice outweighed status, and that from this night on, his understanding of strength would never be the same. The days that followed did not bring headlines or announcements. Only gradual change marked by routines returning to the nursery, by nurses speaking in steadier tones, by 3 small bodies gaining strength measured in ounces and breaths that no longer faltered without warning. Victor Callahan visited the room often, sometimes standing quietly by the doorway, sometimes sitting for long stretches without speaking, learning a patience he had never practiced before. The triplets responded slowly, as children do, unaware of the gravity that had surrounded them, responding only to warmth, to consistency, to care given without expectation. Eliza Moore recovered in a guest room she had never been invited to use before, monitored carefully, given time her body demanded, and when she was finally able to stand on her own again, she did so without ceremony, requesting only to return to work. That request alone told Victor more about her character than any explanation ever could. He met her in the hallway outside the nursery one morning, no witnesses, no intermediaries, and for a moment they stood facing one another in silence, the imbalance that had once defined their interactions replaced by something quieter and far more permanent. Victor spoke first, not with authority but with intention, telling her that the house would no longer pretend she was invisible, that from this day forward her presence would be acknowledged and her well-being protected, not as charity but as recognition. Eliza listened without interrupting, her expression calm, accepting the words not as reward but as confirmation that what she had done had not been dismissed or diminished. She returned to her duties, though her duties themselves began to change, her role reshaped subtly by respect rather than command, and the staff followed Victor's lead without question, understanding instinctively that something fundamental had shifted. Weeks later, when the doctors finally spoke of recovery rather than stabilization, Victor stood beside the cribs and allowed himself to rest a hand lightly against the rail, his shoulders lowering as if releasing a burden he had carried too long. He thought of power differently now, not as something to wield, but as something to steward, a responsibility measured by how it was used when control was no longer guaranteed. Eliza watched from a respectful distance, never inserting herself into moments that were not hers, yet always present, a quiet constant in a space once ruled by fear and hierarchy. There were no grand gestures, no public acknowledgments, only a series of small, deliberate choices that reshaped the household, decisions that placed dignity where convenience once lived. When Eliza passed through the halls, people greeted her by name, not because they were told to, but because it felt necessary. And when Victor spoke of the future, he did so with a humility that surprised those who had known him longest. The triplets grew stronger under attentive care, their cries louder, their presence filling the room with a life that had once seemed out of reach, and each sound served as a reminder of the night everything had changed. Victor never spoke of debt, but he lived its truth daily, ensuring that respect flowed downward as naturally as command once had. And Eliza, returning home each night with the quiet satisfaction of work done honestly, carried no sense of triumph, only the knowledge that she had acted when it mattered, that she had chosen courage over silence. In the stillness of the nursery, as 3 children slept peacefully at last, the world corrected itself in a way no one could have forced, and without applause or recognition, dignity reclaimed its place.